Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Robert Menzies faced 4 Labor opposition leaders during his 18 years as Prime Minister. John Curtin and Ben Chifley reached the top job, but the other 2 never did, despite years of trying. One of these was Arthur Calwell, opposition leader from 1960 until 1967. But he was also Australia's first immigration minister. Joining me to discuss Arthur Calwell is James Franklin, co-author of a new Australian Biographical Monograph on Calwell with Gerry O Nolan. Thank you for joining me on Afternoon Light, James.
Thank you, Georgina. Good to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you on, and particularly great to have someone who is also an expert in the philosophy of mathematics and Australian Catholic history. You're a multi-talented researcher, an academic, and it's wonderful that you've focused on someone who I think deserves a lot more attention in the telling of Australian political history, in Arthur Calwell.
Yes, I think he's been unjustly neglected. People who live now only remember him, if they do at all, as an unsuccessful leader of the Labor Party, but he was incredibly successful earlier in the 1940s as Minister for Immigration.
Yes, look, he was a figure of Melbourne too, and the Melbourne Catholic community, which I think also is underappreciated. I'm sitting here in Melbourne. I know you're in Sydney. But can you tell me about Arthur Calwell's upbringing? Who was he? What shaped him?
A very poor upbringing in central West Melbourne, in a working class area. It was very central to who he was. He said himself, "I grew up in the crowded inner city area with its cottages built on 14-foot frontages and even less, and with evidence of human misery visible to all." So he was the eldest of 7, and his father did have a secure job as a policeman, but was not earning a lot of money. His mother died about the time he left school, and he had to go out there and work. So unlike Menzies, he had no opportunity to go to university, even though he was quite an intellectual person. So you could say he had a chip on his shoulder about capitalism all his life. It certainly shaped his very important dedication to socialist policies, which he helped implement in the Chifley government.
And it's interesting, his father was an Anglican, but his mother was the Irish Catholic.
Yes, his mother and Irish grandmother were Catholic. So, yeah, like Cardinal Pell, in fact, he, a non-Catholic father, but through his mother's influence became one of the leading figures in the church.
He was quite committed to his Irish identity, wasn't he, James?
Yes, to the extent of learning Irish Gaelic and giving a speech in that. And he married, his second marriage after his first wife died was to another dedicated person in Irish culture who was a social editor involved in the 1930s in Irish culture in Melbourne.
So his Catholicism, which was clearly very important to him, and particularly, I guess, coming from the Irish tradition, and his socialist views, they really sort of became like a religion for him, didn't they?
That's right. You could say he had dual faiths, socialism and Catholicism.
Yeah.
Some have thought that those don't mix very well, but the way he did them, he thought of them both as a commitment to the poor and the underdog, and also to diversity. So one of the purposes, undoubtedly, of his immigration program was to transform Australia into a multicultural nation, in the sense that, well, he said that if they hadn't had the immigration program, if Chifley hadn't been an enthusiast for immigration, Australia would have stayed a dull, inbred country of predominantly British stock. Well, I think that says what he was on about. And in 1944, he wrote to Chifley about his determination to develop a heterogeneous society, a society where Irishness and Roman Catholicism would be as acceptable as Englishness and Protestantism, where an Italian background would be as acceptable as a Greek, a Dutch, or any other.
We'll get on to the immigration policies a bit later, but just back to his background. The very famous Catholic Archbishop in Melbourne, Daniel Mannix, was quite a figure of Melbourne society, and obviously particularly Melbourne Catholic society, and he becomes quite a figure in the political realm as well, and Robert Menzies has quite regular dealings with him, as of course does the Catholic activist B.A. Santamaria. But Arthur Calwell was also close, wasn't he, to Archbishop
That's right.
Bishop
He was
Mannix?
A protege. Mannix had three very significant political proteges in descending order of age: Scullin, Australia's first Catholic Prime Minister, and then Calwell, and then B.A. Santamaria. And Santamaria actually believed that the bad relations he had with Calwell were to some extent because he'd replaced Calwell in Mannix's favour. Well, who knows if that's actually true, but it was certainly something that happened. That Calwell was very close to Mannix in, say, the 1930s and regarded him as mentor. And Mannix was very political as well as Catholic and Irish, and in favour of those people developing politics in a Catholic direction, which meant, in effect, as per the papal encyclical Rerum Novarum of the 1890s, to develop a cooperative society where there wasn't class warfare between capitalists and workers, but the society should be a cooperative working together of different interests, a little bit like the Hawke Accord in the 1980s.
And I guess Calwell was able, through his connection with Mannix and I presume adoption of that point of view around promotion of cooperative way of living and working, to incorporate his socialist views in that worldview as well.
Yes, that's right. He thought of socialism not in a communist class warfare sort of sense, but in the sense that all classes in society should have a fair go. So the policies of the Chifley government, like social security and bank nationalisation, were founded on that idea that there should be a widening of who had a say in society to incorporate the poorest people in society.
Calwell was quite an ardent anti-communist, wasn't he? I mean, he shared that with, of course,
yes,
B.A. Santamaria, despite them not having a particularly good relationship. And, of course, he shared that with Archbishop Mannix. But how did he marry that commitment to socialism with anti-communist views?
Well, he just thought they were very different, that communism was a toxic ideology that was against freedom, and, of course, quite rightly about that, and was becoming more evident in the late 1940s with communist expansion in Eastern Europe. But he thought that was nothing like socialism as he and Chifley understood it, which was about social security and, for example, things like the health system in England at that time, that it was to help the poorest in society. And they thought, in fact, that if the Conservative parties didn't approve of socialist expansion like that, then that played into the hands of communists, because the communists, as in the Depression and the war, would be able to represent themselves as the only solution to the evils of poverty.
It's interesting, though, in a lot of his speeches, despite him being anti-communist, he does talk about class. It's quite a feature, and I know when he was Minister for Information, this is a bit later, obviously once he'd got into politics, he's talking about the leading newspapers of Australia being run by press barons and class enemies. So, you know,
he could speak like that.
Yeah. So it's interesting. He was still using some of the language of communism despite not being in favour of it.
That's right. He certainly thought that the rich capitalists were to some extent responsible for the evils of poverty that he'd grown up in. But as you say, the capitalist that he particularly hates was press barons. He says in 1941, that the press is owned for the most part by financial crooks and is edited for the most part by mental harlots. Theirs are the newspapers that libel, malign, traduce and defame us. And of course, this is not totally untrue. The press gave as good as they got.
They've got to sell newspapers, I guess.
Well, yes, they ran cartoons. The cartoonist Frith ran cartoons for years, with Calwell represented as a cranky old cockatoo saying, curse the press, curse the press. So, yeah, they did have a toxic relationship, no doubt about that.
Was there a reason why they depicted him as a cockatoo? Is it to do with his hairstyle or?
A little. It was actually probably more to do with his voice. Calwell had an unfortunate voice because he'd almost died of diphtheria as a child, and his voice was somewhat raspy and high-pitched, which is not really ideal for a politician. And I think you could say it sounded a little bit like a screeching cockatoo if you didn't like him very much, which they didn't.
No, indeed. James, before Calwell went into politics, he was a public servant, wasn't he? Can you tell me about that part of his life and how did he was very involved in the Labor Party, but how did he manage that as a public servant, supposedly non-partisan?
So his day job was a fairly low-grade public service job, originally in the Department of Agriculture, in the Victorian department. But he didn't spend much spare time on that trying to rise through the ranks. He was spending all his time in Labor politics, branch secretary in his teens and so on, and a member of the Clerical Officers Association in Victoria. And, well, in theory, public servants were not supposed to be involved in formal politics. But I guess it's the same theory that ABC commentators now are not supposed to be involved in formal politics, but no one takes very much notice of that. And in his time, it would have been probably different if he had a high-level public service job, and it would have been difficult, but it was not worried very much about. And it was not surprising that as a union representing his own employees in the unions and then involved in Labor politics from that wasn't regarded, I think, as a very difficult combination, even though probably in theory the regulations said don't do that.
He waited a while, didn't he, to run for pre-selection for the seat of Melbourne, which he eventually held and represented his entire political career.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's a remarkable incident in his rise. He was branch secretary for a long time and assistant to Dr. Maloney, who'd been a Labor member since forever. And Dr. Maloney was Labor member of the Victorian Parliament since before there was a Labor Party, and he was 80 in 1934. But Calwell didn't challenge for pre-selection and waited for Dr. Maloney to die in 1940, after which he more or less inherited the seat. So he was loyal in that sense, perhaps to the detriment of his own career. There was a question whether the same happened with Evatt later, whether he should have, when he was deputy leader to Evatt in the 50s, undoubtedly the Labor Party would have been better off with Calwell as leader earlier. He did, in effect, challenge once, but he could have possibly worked harder.
Yes. Well, loyalty can be a good thing in politics, but it can also mean you don't advance.
Miss an opportunity.
Yes, a miss opportunity. I'm sure we can both think of several examples in more recent years of people who have perhaps suffered for their loyalty. So he's elected to Parliament finally in 1940 to the seat of Melbourne, and this is when Robert Menzies is Prime Minister, and then, of course, John Curtin becomes Prime Minister in 1941, Labor Prime Minister. This is an opportunity, isn't it, eventually for Arthur Calwell. He eventually is appointed Minister for Information, which in these days sounds a little bit insidious, doesn't it? But what was he like?
That's right. It was. It was a euphemism in wartime for censorship and propaganda, really.
Yeah.
So there was undoubtedly a need for some censorship and propaganda, so it was felt better for morale to pretty much cover up how bad the bombing of Darwin was. Well, there was, you do have to cover up some bad news, but perhaps Calwell went too far, and certainly the press barons thought he went too far. And Calwell was briefly overseas. They took him on and printed a blank front page when he'd censored some things. They did provoke him by sending into the censor comparisons of Calwell and Goebbels. Well, that's going pretty far. But so he did rise to the bait, and eventually they won in the High Court, and he had egg on his face over trying to censor the press. Perhaps it was all a bit of a storm in a teacup all the same. The press did more or less behave responsibly over war news, and the censorship wasn't really too onerous, I think. But both sides were looking for a stoush, and they got one, and it was great theatre, but whether it really meant anything, I'm not sure.
There's an incredible incident in 1944, isn't there, when the Sunday Telegraph prints a blank space on part of its front page to denote censorship. Can you tell me a bit about that? And this is, of course, when Calwell was still Minister for Information.
Minister for Information, yes. So what Calwell had censored was a speech by the head of the Press Barons Association. I forget what the name of it was, Henderson.
Australian Newspaper Proprietors Association, I think.
Australian Newspaper Proprietors, that's exactly right.
I'm cheating, I have it written down in front of me.
Oh, great, you have it there. I should have it too. It was calling for less censorship and criticising Calwell himself over the amount of censorship. So Calwell censored that, and that was a perfect opportunity for them to run a largely blank front page and call in the expensive lawyers. So it went for some days, and eventually the proprietors won in the High Court, and that was that. And it didn't repeat. But it did mean that when it came to the immigration issue, it was very doubtful initially if Calwell would be able to get the support of the press, large amounts of foreign immigration. In fact, he did. And Calwell himself thought that the main obstacle to his immigration program was publicity, that there would be bad publicity and the Australian people wouldn't put up with it. So things had to change. And it was very remarkable that he got really complete cooperation from the press, except the communist press and the Protestant press, over the immigration program. It was very remarkable, perhaps Australia's most remarkable news management.
James, I mean, aside from him disliking the press barons and, obviously you had the wonderful quote about the financial crooks and mental harlots, was there a reason why he didn't like the press? I mean, was it just because he saw it as a vehicle of capitalism, or, he'd had a bad experience in the 1930s, hadn't he, when he was a public servant?
Yes, so he did regard it as, I suppose, cutting edge of capitalists keeping themselves in power. But of course, it's self-fulfilling. Yes, as soon as he starts attacking them, they love to attack him back and get their cartoonists onto him and so on. And it just goes from bad to worse. Possibly both sides were enjoying it up to a point, but it's still perhaps unfortunate for the management of Australia.
It's funny, Robert Menzies also didn't have much time for the press, although as a politician, you'd think it's an absolutely key vehicle through which to communicate. I mean, you have to work with the press.
You have to work with them, but you don't have to like them.
No, you don't. I guess not.
And of course, every time the politicians do get misreported and taken out of context and so on, naturally they get hot under the collar. That's very understandable. And they do pick on anyone that's down.
Yeah. Curtin had appointed Calwell as Minister for Information, but their relationship wasn't particularly good, was it? I mean, you had I think you have a quote in your book from Calwell where he said, "Curtin held a slumbering resentment against me." So,
yes, that's right. And again, I'm sure it was self-fulfilling to some extent. So sometimes they weren't talking. Well, they weren't getting along personally well, but there were some issues that they were disagreeing on. One important issue was how much you should put the war first and socialist policy second. Calwell was in favour of what was then called post-war reconstruction, of which Chifley was the minister, for trying to get things done in the line of social security, whereas Curtin was very much war first. But the real issue they disagreed on was conscription. So Curtin, like most of the important Labor people, had been solidly anti-conscription in the First World War, as had Calwell. But in the Second World War, the threat of the Japanese invasion meant that Curtin and the majority of his government approved conscription just for local service, meaning in the Southwest Pacific, including New Guinea. And Calwell and a few others dug in and said, no, I've been anti-conscription always, and I'm not going to change now. And there was a lot of ill feeling about that, not surprisingly, in the fraught war years with the threat of invasion so close.
Yeah. What about his relationship with Chifley? Because I was looking at all the leaders he deals with through politics. He doesn't seem to really ever get on with them, not with Chifley much, not with Evatt much, and definitely not with Whitlam, who he tries to throw out of the Labor Party. So.
Yeah, that's right. But he kind of got to get on best with Chifley. They were aligned, their points of view are the same. Chifley also came from a Catholic background and thought the same in a socialist and Catholic way, even though he was formally excommunicated from the Catholic Church because he got married in a Presbyterian church. He was still a believing Catholic and went to Mass. They were on the same page, I think, and in particular, they were on the same page about the need for immigration policy. So personally, well, perhaps they weren't exactly close, but they respected each other and were in favour of each other's main political lines.
Obviously, John Curtin very sadly dies in office in 1945 and Chifley succeeds him. But Chifley appoints Calwell as the first ever Australian immigration minister, which I should say I am the granddaughter of an Australian immigration minister in Alec Downer, who was immigration minister in the 50s. So I have a strong interest in Arthur Calwell being the first ever immigration minister and, of course, doing some quite incredible things in that area of policy.
Yes, that's right. So it was significant of the government that they did appoint a first immigration minister, and especially because Labor tradition is anti-immigration. Certainly between the wars, Chifley himself had got elected in Macquarie with a very vicious anti-foreign worker campaign. But with the...
Yes, I have a quote here, James, from Ben Chifley in 1928, which is probably what you're talking about, where he says he was running a campaign against, I quote, hundreds of Italians, Yugoslavians and Czechoslovakians who are scabs of the worst kind.
Yeah, that's right.
Not exactly welcoming language.
Not welcoming,
No.
And you can imagine there are very tiny numbers of any of the Czechs and Yugoslavians there at that time. And in the late 30s, with Jewish immigration, Australian people had found it very strange to have these refos, as they were called, with their different ways, even though there were only 7,000 of them. It was really an enormous U-turn for Australia, and especially the Labor Party, to suddenly decide it was in favour of immigration and including non-English speaking immigration. But they did that. Calwell did it, but very much backed up by Chifley and the rest of the government. And in the end, it was a bipartisan policy. Menzies was in favour of it. The unions got in favour of it, and what the union leaders were persuaded to keep their members shut up when they started complaining about the foreign workers. Virtually everyone was in favour of it, except the communists who downloaded the Moscow line about Calwell's bought fascist concentration camp guards and so on. It was an amazing thing, and that the press got on side as well. Even the RSL was persuaded that people who fought on the other side of the war, like Ukrainians and Latvians, were quite all right. So that was remarkable that you could get everyone on board.
Yeah, I mean, and we need to remember this was a period when Australia certainly had the White Australia policy, fully implemented. So in this populate or perish policy of the Chifley government, which was implemented by Calwell as Minister for Immigration, this was really expanding the definition of who was white, wasn't it? So your migrants wouldn't just come from Britain and Ireland, Scotland and Wales and the like, that they would come from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe.
So nearly all immigration in Australia earlier had been British or Irish, and in the Italians and Greeks were not unknown, but it was regarded as a little strange to have people who didn't speak English. And Calwell was interested in having white people, well, meaning European people. He would have liked Irish, Americans and Canadians, for example, but there weren't any available, or Scandinavians. But it suddenly came to light that there were 1 million refugees from the Red Army who were Eastern Europeans who'd fled west to escape the communists and were sitting in camps in Western Europe, mostly Western Germany and Italy and Austria. And there was little known but a coordinated international plan by the Western powers to distribute the whole 1 million of them around the world. The British and Americans were in charge of it, largely Whitehall. And the mind of the Whitehall mandarins turned to a country far away that had got rid of surplus population for the British in the past. And they said to the Australians, "Can you take some?" And Calwell was very enthusiastic to have them. The main difficulty was really shipping. that because there was such a shortage of shipping after the U-boats had sent so many of the merchant fleets of the Western powers to the bottom of the sea, but some troop ships were found and got underway. Starting with the first shipload in 1947 was all Baltic peoples, Latvians, Lithuanians and Estonians.
And in the end, Australia becomes one of the world's leading recipients of DPs, displaced peoples.
Displaced persons, as they were called, yes.
Yeah.
That's right. They took 170 or 180,000 of them up to 1950. So they were one of the biggest countries taking those million displaced persons. So it's remarkable, especially since Australia was the most distant country, that, of course, it's a lot easier to ship them to Britain or Canada. So Calwell had to work quite hard to make sure Australia was taken seriously, given the long turnaround time of the ships.
It's interesting reading what Calwell was writing to Chifley in 1944, and this, of course, is before the beginning of receiving the displaced persons. But his idea of what a heterogeneous society is in Australia is quite different from what we would envisage it today. He writes of his determination to develop a heterogeneous society, a society where Irishness and Roman Catholicism would be as acceptable as Englishness and Protestantism, where an Italian background would be as acceptable as a Greek, a Dutch, or any other. And his migration program in the end was very disproportionately, I think, focused on Catholic migrants in distinction from Protestant migrants who had been more numerous in the early years of Australia's migration.
That's right. Well, there weren't many Protestants in Eastern Europe. So It just so happened that the Poles and Ukrainians who led the Red Army, largely Catholics. The Baltic peoples were not. And actually, it seems that the choice of Baltic peoples to lead the program, it helped that they were kind of blonde, blue-eyed Protestant. It was felt this would look good. And they put them in front of the cameras out here, and it did look good.
Yes, it's amazing reading the Calwell's reflections on this, that they were choosing the most beautiful, the blondest, the most blue-eyed Baltic migrants for the ad campaigns, or at least the media images, because, the Australian public was more likely to be receptive to these quite sort of attractive migrants, even if the rest of the boat didn't look quite like that.
Yeah, that's right. The later boatloads were a little bit darker.
Yeah.
But that's right. So, he says that if he didn't say this at the time exactly, but in his autobiography years later, he said, many were red-headed and blue-eyed, but also a number of natural platinum blondes of both sexes, and they were all between 15 and 35, no Jews. And he said, it was not hard to sell immigration to the Australian people once the press published photographs of that group. To be frank, they looked a lot better when they were photographed beside him at the dockside as well. Calwell was not the most handsome-looking of persons. Well, it was a great success, and Calwell did that because he felt that news management was the most important thing, and that it was very likely that there'd be xenophobic reaction. There wasn't much, but it didn't happen by accident, and he was, I think, quite right to work very hard to manage the news.
These DPs, who are called beautiful bolts often, which I love that. Love that title.
Yeah, there's a book of the book of that title.
Yeah. Tell me about the experience that was afforded to them when they arrived, because I've seen photos of the migrant worker camps. Obviously, Snowy Hydro, a lot of them are sent over there to help with that huge nation building project. Looks pretty tough conditions, but anyway.
It's pretty tough from our perspective, but from their perspective, it looked pretty good after the camps in Europe. So they were bonded to work for 2 years, which meant they actually provided with work, but they had to take the work that was offered. And they did start out in these former army camps. Well, it wasn't luxury accommodation, but compared to what they'd come from, it was pretty good. And especially the food was better. I remember talking to one of them who was Hungarian, and she said they arrived at the camp in, I think, Bathurst, and they were given a pat of butter, like the little things that you get beside your bread roll to eat in a restaurant today. And they said, is that for a week or a month? They said, no, that's for today. And they couldn't believe it. And meat every day. They couldn't believe that. So it was a tough life, but it was gratefully accepted because of what they'd come from. The camps in Europe were just awful. So My wife is Latvian and I spent the first few years in a camp in North Germany. Well, people would, trucks came around every day to take away the dead bodies. It was something you wanted to get away from, and to be at the far end of the earth from that was pretty good. Mostly find success. So after the 2 years, they moved into the community and they were given help with English. And the whole thing was possible because employment was good. The economy boomed at that time and new housing was built. And except for the occasional glitches with kind of minor brief depressions, things went quite well employment-wise, and that certainly helped everything. And the migrants themselves proved, in almost all cases, keen to learn English and become new Australians, as Calwell branded them.
And how vigorously was assimilation pursued with the new Australians? They were expected to learn English, they obviously were expected to work and then, buy their own houses. There wasn't a huge welfare state smothering them with support. It was really sink or swim,
That's
wasn't
right.
it?
Yes, but the welfare state was starting at this time and chiefly had increased greatly pensions, child endowment and so on. And the migrants had equal rights to that, which many of them found quite surprising after Europe. But most of them were, of course, keen to get on with making their lives in the new country, especially as most of them were reasonably young. There was a downside for those who had European qualifications that weren't recognised. Except for that, conditions were quite all right. They had equality of citizenship and votes and so on, exactly the same as Australians, without having to wait. So the only thing they had to wait for was freedom of employment because they were bonded to work for 2 years. So they were keen to vote. It was disappointing for Calwell that the way they voted weren't for him.
Yes, a lot of them had come from countries that had fallen into the Soviet Union.
That's right. They were refugees from the Red Army, and most of them thought that Menzies was soft on communism, and so, let alone the Labor Party.
Yeah, well, if that's your point of reference, then yes, Labor's probably not going to get your vote.
No, not going to get their vote. So they were keen supporters of the DLP in the 1960s in many cases. And Whitlam was very rude about them, the famous incident.
James, despite this amazing immigration program that Calwell was in charge of and the welcoming of so many thousands of migrants, particularly DPs from Eastern Europe, if you weren't white, it was a big problem. I mean, Calwell was still committed to white Australia, and there were some very sad incidents, weren't there, of non-white refugees who were admitted during the war being kicked out of Australia, or non-white wives of Australian soldiers were deported. So as a humanitarian response, this seems deeply troubling.
Yes, and I think it was not right, but at the same time, you do need to understand why that was happening. Partly the slogan "populate or perish" mean populate or perish at the hands of Asian invaders, which to begin with meant the Japanese, but later meant the Chinese communists. So white immigration was felt to be a bulwark against those invasions. The reason that Calwell gave, being such an enthusiastic supporter of the White Australia policy, is that multiracial policy countries didn't work. So he said, as of 1948 or 49, you can certainly see his point. So in his defence of the White Australia policy in 1949, he says, the evils that plague America, that distress South Africa, that embitter Malaya and that worry Fiji, the evils of miscegenation always result in rioting and bloodshed. Well, it was the beginning of apartheid in South Africa. It was the partition of Palestine, which is one of the worst incidents of interracial violence. And things in racial discrimination was almost at its peak in America. So you can see why there's a case for saying, as of 1948, that multiracial societies don't work. Now, it turned out later that they could be made to work. And we've benefited greatly from our own society and others, like, for example, Singapore, being made to work. But I do understand why somebody in 1949 thought they couldn't.
Yeah.
Just on the basis of the empirical evidence. Calwell said that there was no suggestion of superiority of a white race or anything like that. And as far as I know, he believed that, but he said the Asians should be allowed to develop economically and so on and culturally in Asia, but it didn't make sense to mix them in other countries.
I should also add, he does say, I think in his autobiography, that underlying the White Australia policy is no suggestion of racial superiority. So he was quite clear that he didn't see it as one race being better than the other issue. It was, as you say, this concern about interracial violence. I wanted to move forward a bit to the Menzies era, James, and obviously Labor's in opposition, and Labor is in opposition for a very, very long time, from 1949 when Chifley loses the election to Menzies through to 1972 when Gough Whitlam finally wins the election for Labor. So 22 years is a long, long time to be in opposition. But obviously Calwell is a key feature in the Labor Party. And Labor experiences its third split in the 1950s under the leadership of Doc Evatt. How did Calwell view this? Because, I mean, he's from Victoria where the split is most serious, and he's a strong Catholic. He's, as you said, a real follower of Archbishop Mannix, not particularly close with Santa Maria, of course, but still he's an anti-communist. So in a way he could have gone with Santa Maria and split off, but he doesn't. He sticks with Labor despite all his tendencies.
Yeah. That's right. It was extremely painful for him. And as you say, because he was very much in the middle and could almost have gone either way, because he was Catholic anti-communist and suspected by some of exactly being a movement person. And the fact that he did go on the Labor side led to a great deal of personal bitterness against him by his former friends who were Catholic Labor people, joined in the movement and then the DLP, and especially Mannix. So Mannix, it was extremely painful for Calwell that Mannix was telling people not to vote for him. And in one election, Mannix said a vote for the Evatt Party is a vote for communism. And Mannix said that Mannix would not appear at any events where Labor people spoke. So that was personally painful for him. And they were only, I suppose, reconciled to some extent at Mannix's deathbed in 1963 when Calwell went and prayed at his bedside just shortly before he died. So that was painful, but it was painful, of course, politically as well, because the split meant that Labor was unelectable, especially in Victoria where the split was worse.
And he had to deal with Evatt, who had his problems. And of course, I think Calwell was Evatt's deputy, wasn't he?
Evatt's deputy throughout the 50s.
Yeah. So he played quite an instrumental role, of course, in the unfolding of the Petrov affair and trying to manage unsuccessfully Calwell's decision-making around that and around the Royal Commission as well, into the Petrov affair.
That's right. So trying to be a responsible leader when Evatt was being irresponsible as party leader and getting everything wrong and getting worse and worse in his mental health as time went on was a very difficult task and one that nobody probably could do well. So he tried to keep the Labor Party on an even keel, but it wasn't working.
No, not at all. And, of course, keeps losing election after election to Robert Menzies. He becomes leader finally after being so loyal to Evatt, although he does sort of suggest that he might run or challenge Evatt, but then...
At the time, that's right. At the time of the split in 1954, he did offer himself. He said he'd stand for leader if the leadership positions were spilled, but he lost 2-1.
Yeah, so pretty definitive there. But he does eventually become leader in 1960 and he almost wins the 61 election, which is amazing. I mean,
it was amazing. Everyone was amazed, including himself, that they got up. It was a very remarkable event that he got. It's said to be 50.5% of the two-party preferred vote.
Yeah.
Probably that's close to it. And he came within 1 or 2 seats winning. It was extraordinary, when it was quite unexpected leading up to the election.
Yeah, and the other unexpected thing of this election was that the media supported him too. Well, at least the Sydney Morning Herald did, owned by Warwick Fairfax.
Yes, that's right. Having Warwick Fairfax support you, well, finally a press baron had come to the party, if only temporarily. It was unexpected, and the press baron, Warwick Fairfax, even sent someone to help Calwell write his speeches. It was just unbelievable. It didn't last very long, and it was hard to say why. A lot had to do with the credit squeeze, as it was called, in 1961, where the Menzies government was thought by many, including the leading capitalists, to be managing the economy badly because there was a sudden deflation. Looking back, it was the Menzies government dipping their toe into deregulation, which probably in retrospect was a good thing, but it didn't work out too well with a sudden rush of imports, and a lot of people were thrown out of jobs and businesses closed.
Yes, and reflecting on the two-party preferred vote at the 61 election, where Labor does indeed win the vote but not the majority of seats, which of course is the crucial thing. I know that the detailed analysis that the Australian Electoral Commission did was that where Labor had done really well was in seats they already held, and so they won big in their own seats, but obviously didn't win the majority of seats across the entire electorate.
No, that's right. Yeah, it was seats like Calwell's own Melbourne inevitably had enormous Labor majorities that are wasted electorally.
Yeah. Calwell is famous not perhaps for something he wanted to be famous for, and Gough Whitlam is joined in this too, for that photograph. I think, is it outside the Kingston Hotel?
The Kingston Hotel in Canberra,
yes.
Yes.
When the faceless men, the Labor executive making a decision, and Gough Whitlam and Calwell are standing outside waiting to be told what the policy is.
What policy, and their photograph. One of Australia's great press photographs.
Amazing photograph. I mean, this pointed to a real problem, didn't it, for old Labor in a way?
Yes, that's right. There's something dysfunctional about the Labor Party and its constitution that allows that kind of thing to happen, that these 36 faceless men, one of whom was actually a woman, were able to dictate to the parliamentary party, who had very little say in what policy was. And the parliamentary party, of course, elected by the actual people, the voters, just had to put up with it. So Whitlam, when he became leader, successfully, up to a point anyway, did something about that and reduced the power of those faceless persons, but not, of course, entirely.
Was Calwell the end of old Labor? I mean, he loses the 63 election really, really badly, and it's amazing to think back then that both Evatt and Calwell were allowed to lose 3 elections in a row each. And there was sort of give them another go sense of loyalty to these leaders, whereas these days, if a leader, even without facing an election, they might be turfed out of the position by their party. But did he represent...
That's right, the revolving door.
Yeah, revolving door. Well, yes, even prime ministers have been turfed out, not just opposition leaders. But when he eventually does leave the leadership in 67 and Gough Whitlam, who he tried to, as I said earlier, who tried to eject from the Labor Party over the issue of state aid, does that represent the end of the old Labor, do you think? I mean, Calwell was such a senior figure in the Labor movement, but he also had views that perhaps weren't going to advance the party politically.
That's right. So, if, for example, support for the White Australia policy, which they were getting rid of at that time, and actually his opposition to conscription again was unpopular. In that case, conscription to the Vietnam War, as against conscription then as he was in 1941 and 1916. Well, it was the end of the dominance of old Labor. So undoubtedly Whitlam represented a different constituency, that more educated, more intellectual, I suppose, more trendy, more 1960s people as leaders of Labor. But it's not as if the old Labor exactly went away, and Labor's consistently had issues with the strength of the left-wing unions from then to the present day.
It's interesting.
So the issues are still there. It's just that we don't have a union leader of the old style like Calwell was. Of course, we had a union leader in the new style like Bob Hawke, but he was doing things differently to the old socialist style of Calwell.
It's interesting, in 1970, I think it was a booklet that Calwell had contributed to, and he contributed an article, A Great Russian Patriot, for a booklet, Lenin Through Australian Eyes, and it was published by the Novosti Press Agency. He says of the Australian Labor Party that it was turning into a pretty bourgeois party, which would be infested by social climbing, status-seeking, lower middle class and white-collar people.
Yeah, meaning Whitlam and his friends, obviously.
Meaning Whitlam and his friends. It's worth reflecting on that quote, I think, because it's also an evolution of the political support for parties through the decades, from the Labor Party of the 1880s, very much a party of a working class, of the trade union movement, through to 2023, where I think it's a party of intelligentsia, university educated people, much more professional support, and that working class nexus isn't nearly as strong as it once was. I mean, we can quibble over all the data, but I feel like Calwell's assessment back in 1970 still sticks to an extent.
Yes, that is right. Things had changed, and from then, Labor relied principally on intelligentsia and ABC journalists and every other person of that class, as they call them. They abuse the inner city latte drinkers.
Nothing wrong with a latte or true. Living in the inner city, by the
way. Yeah. But it is true that, of course, there are democratic things, and there are a lot more university graduates and a lot fewer shearers and so on. Australia now has a lot more university professors than it does have shearers. So, I mean, what do you expect? But at the same time, there is actual working people, and they've tended to move towards support of the Liberal Party, for example. And that's why the Liberal Party is looking so good in outer suburban seats in both Melbourne and Sydney, for example.
Well, James Franklin, thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light today to talk about Arthur Calwell. I am looking forward to the formal release and launch of your monograph. I think it's an incredibly important contribution to the understanding of this political figure who deserves much more attention for particularly his contribution to the development of Australia's immigration program. Thank you very much for your time today.
Many thanks, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook.